Imagine for a moment, you're planning with your friends months in advance to see an upcoming movie at the theater. You're excitedly talking about how that amazing day will unfold over and over again. Maybe it'll be the most perfect day of your life. And then that day comes. You walk into the city's most popular movie theater with your friends, grab some popcorn, and sit down in your seat in the completely packed auditorium. Everything is perfect. You're having a fun day with your friends. About 2 hours have passed since the movie started. You can't even tell how fast time is flying. But 5 minutes later, you couldn't have predicted that a transformer fire in the parking lot would turn a cinema hall filled with hundreds of people into a death trap. But it doesn't even end there. The cinema had only one functional exit, and all other emergency exits were either locked or blocked. In fact, if you had known that the transformer had malfunctioned before and caught fire earlier that same morning, but was hastily repaired without proper inspection, you most likely would have skipped going to that theater. In this video, we're going to cover from every angle a true story of how small negligence can lead to massive disasters, the Uphaar Cinema Tragedy. And in this video, you'll discover the violations and what really happened that you won't hear anywhere else. But before we dive into this story, please write in the comments where you're watching this video from and what time it is right now. And to help us reach 1,000 subscribers, please hit that subscribe button. We research and present stories forgotten by time, bringing you every detail. If you're ready, let's begin. The Uphaar Cinema was a prominent movie theater located in Green Park, South Delhi, a place where middle-class families, young couples, and groups of friends gathered to escape into the world of cinema. Operating since the 1970s, Uphaar had become more than just a theater. It was a cultural landmark in an affluent neighborhood, a destination where Delhi residents came to experience the magic of Bollywood on the big screen. The cinema's location made it particularly attractive, drawing moviegoers from across the sprawling capital city who sought quality entertainment in a comfortable modern setting. On June 13th, 1997, it was a typical Friday afternoon in Delhi. The summer heat was oppressive, driving people indoors to seek refuge in air-conditioned spaces. The 3 p.m. show of Border, a highly anticipated patriotic war film, had drawn a near-capacity crowd. Families with children, groups of college students, young couples on dates, and individuals looking to spend a few hours away from the heat, all had converged on Uphaar Cinema that afternoon. The excitement in the air was palpable. Border was generating significant buzz, and many in the audience had been looking forward to this screening for days, perhaps weeks. The theater filled quickly. People purchased their tickets, bought snacks from the concession stand, and made their way to their assigned seats. The balcony section was particularly full, offering what many considered the best views of the screen. Parents settled in with their children, friends chatted excitedly about the film they were about to watch, and couples found their seats in the darkened hall. As the lights dimmed and the opening credits began to roll, approximately 700 people sat in anticipation, unaware that they were sitting in what would soon become a death trap. For the first 2 hours, everything proceeded normally. The audience was engrossed in the film's dramatic war sequences and emotional storylines. Air conditioning kept the theater comfortable, despite the sweltering heat outside. Moviegoers laughed, gasped, and reacted to the scenes unfolding on screen. Time passed quickly, as it always does when you're absorbed in a good story. Nobody noticed anything unusual. Nobody suspected that beneath their feet, in the building's basement parking area, a disaster was about to unfold. What the audience didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that the very building designed to entertain them had been transformed into a ticking time bomb through years of negligence, illegal modifications, and deliberate safety violations. The Ansal brothers, Gopal and Sushil, who owned the cinema, had made numerous unauthorized changes to the building's structure. Emergency exits had been blocked or locked. The parking area had been illegally converted into additional seating and office spaces. Safety equipment was outdated or non-functional. The transformer in the basement had a documented history of problems, including a fire earlier that very morning that had been hastily and improperly repaired by unqualified personnel. At approximately 4:55 p.m., as the film approached its climax, the transformer in the basement parking area short-circuited and caught fire. The initial flames were small, but they quickly spread to nearby vehicles parked in the lot. What made this fire particularly deadly wasn't the flames themselves. It was the thick, toxic smoke that began billowing from the burning transformer and vehicles. This smoke contained lethal levels of carbon monoxide and other poisonous gases, and it began seeking pathways upward through the building. The building's design, or rather, its compromised design, after years of unauthorized modifications, created the perfect conditions for disaster. The smoke traveled through unprotected pathways, air conditioning ducts, and stairwells, rising rapidly toward the main theater hall. For several minutes, the audience remained completely unaware of the danger building beneath them. The movie continued playing, the sound system masking any warning sounds from below. Then, around 5:05 p.m., the building's electrical system failed completely. The screen went black, the sound stopped, the air conditioning shut down, and most critically, the lights went out, plunging nearly 700 people into complete darkness. In that moment, confusion swept through the audience. People called out, asking what had happened. Some laughed nervously, assuming it was a temporary power outage that would be resolved in moments. Parents reached for their children in the darkness. But what should have happened next? The automatic activation of emergency lighting never occurred. The emergency lighting system, which was supposed to illuminate exit routes during power failures, was non-functional. Within seconds of the power failure, people began to smell smoke. The acrid odor of burning plastic and chemicals filled the air. Confusion quickly turned to concern, and concern rapidly escalated into panic as the darkness filled with increasingly thick, choking smoke. The air conditioning ducts, now silent but still open, continued to channel toxic fumes directly into the theater hall. Visibility dropped to near zero. People began coughing, their eyes burning from the smoke. The temperature in the sealed theater began rising rapidly. Panic erupted as audience members realized they were in serious danger. People jumped from their seats, shouting, crying, pushing toward where they remembered the exits to be. But in the pitch black, smoke-filled darkness, finding exits became nearly impossible. Parents frantically searched for their children in the chaos. Friends became separated in the crush of bodies. The balcony section, where the smoke accumulated most heavily due to heat rising, became an especially deadly trap. Those who managed to reach what they thought were emergency exits found doors that wouldn't open. Some exits were locked from the outside. Others were blocked by additional seats that had been illegally installed to increase the theater's capacity beyond its license limit of 540 to over 700 people. The main exit, the only one that was functional, became a deadly bottleneck as hundreds of panicked people converged on it simultaneously. In the darkness and smoke, people stumbled over seats, fell in the aisles, and were trampled by others, desperately trying to escape. The smoke was so thick now that people couldn't see their own hands in front of their faces. Each breath became more difficult, the toxic fumes burning throats and lungs. The theater staff, who should have been trained in emergency evacuation procedures, had received no such training. There had been no fire drills, no emergency preparedness training, no clear protocols for such situations. When the crisis hit, they were as lost and panicked as the audience. The cinema management failed to immediately alert the fire services, wasting precious minutes that could have saved lives. Nobody made announcements over any kind of backup communication system, because no such system existed. The fire alarm system, which should have automatically activated and alerted everyone to evacuate, had been disabled. In the balcony section, when most of the deaths would occur, the situation became apocalyptic. The thick smoke rose to fill the upper portions of the theater first, concentrating the highest levels of toxic gases, exactly where the largest group of people were trapped. Investigations would later reveal that exhaust fans on the balcony walls, which might have provided some ventilation, had been deliberately blocked with cardboard. Without any way to clear the smoke, and with all emergency exits blocked or locked, the balcony became a gas chamber. People collapsed in their seats, overcome by carbon monoxide poisoning before they could even attempt to escape. Others made it to the aisles or stairways, but fell unconscious from toxic fumes, while searching desperately for exits in the suffocating darkness. Some managed to crawl partway downstairs before the smoke overcame them. In some cases, entire families died together, parents clutching children in their final moments. The smoke was so dense and toxic that victims lost consciousness within minutes of exposure. Many never even made it out of their seats. Outside the theater, as smoke began billowing from the building, passers-by and shopkeepers in the area noticed something was wrong. Some people who had been in the lobby or who had managed to escape in the initial moments of the power failure began shouting for help, but critical time was lost. The fire department wasn't notified until approximately 30 minutes after the fire had started, a delay that proved fatal for many trapped inside. When firefighters finally arrived, they were confronted with a scene of chaos and horror. Smoke poured from every opening in the building. People who had managed to escape were collapsed on the sidewalk, coughing and gasping for air. Family members screamed for loved ones still trapped inside. Firefighters donned breathing apparatus and entered the smoke-filled building, beginning the grim work of rescue and recovery. What they found inside would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Bodies in seats, people who had died so quickly from toxic smoke that they never even stood up. Bodies piled at locked exits, people who had desperately tried to escape but found their way blocked. Bodies on stairways, in corridors, in bathrooms where some had fled, hoping to find air. The balcony section was the worst. Victims sprawled across seats and aisles, some still clutching purses or personal items, frozen in their final moments of panic and desperation. The rescue operation continued into the evening. Firefighters carried body after body out of the building as devastated family members watched from behind police barricades, hoping desperately not to recognize their loved ones among the dead. Survivors were rushed to hospitals across Delhi, many suffering from severe smoke inhalation, burns, and injuries sustained during escape attempts. The hospitals were quickly overwhelmed. Emergency rooms filled with victims struggling to breathe, their lungs damaged by toxic fumes. Doctors and nurses worked frantically to save lives, but for many the damage was already too severe. As the final count emerged, the scale of the tragedy became clear. 59 people had died, most from carbon monoxide poisoning and asphyxiation. Over 100 others were injured, some critically. The youngest victims included children who had come with their families for an afternoon at the movies. The oldest were senior citizens who had looked forward to a few hours of entertainment. Among the dead were parents, children, siblings, spouses, entire families in some cases. Each victim had a story, a life, dreams and plans that would never be fulfilled. They had walked into that theater expecting to watch a movie. They never walked out. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Families descended on hospitals and the cinema site, searching desperately for information about missing loved ones. Morgues, were overwhelmed with bodies. The government scrambled to respond, announcing compensation packages and promising investigations. But for the families of the victims, no amount of money could compensate for their loss. No investigation could bring back their loved ones. The question that haunted everyone was simple but terrible. How could this have happened? As investigators began examining the site and reviewing the cinema's records, a disturbing picture emerged. This was not a tragic accident. It was a disaster waiting to happen, the inevitable result of years of negligence, corruption, and deliberate safety violations. Every safety system that should have prevented the tragedy or minimized casualties had failed, and in most cases, these failures were not accidental, but the direct result of human choices, prioritizing profit over safety. The transformer that had started the fire should never have been installed where it was. It lacked proper clearances and had been placed too close to the parking area, violating electrical safety codes. Worse, it had a documented history of malfunctions. TD, Plyfee, on the very morning of the disaster, the transformer had caught fire, but was hastily repaired by unqualified personnel who failed to identify or address the underlying problems. No proper inspection had been conducted. No qualified electrical engineer had certified the repair as safe. The transformer was simply patched up and put back into service, a ticking time bomb waiting for the right conditions to explode. The parking basement itself was a violation. Portions of it had been illegally converted into office spaces and a separate viewing room, creating additional potential ignition sources near the faulty transformer. These modifications had been made without any regulatory approval, in direct violation of building safety codes. The building's entire electrical system was substandard, with improper wiring, inadequate insulation, and no proper circuit breakers or isolation mechanisms that could have contained the initial fire. But the electrical failures, while they started the fire, were not what killed most of the victims. What turned a basement transformer fire into a mass casualty event was the systematic dismantling of every safety system designed to protect people in such emergencies. The emergency exits, the most basic safety feature of any public building, had been deliberately compromised. Several exits were locked from the outside, a practice the cinema management had adopted to prevent unauthorized entry and exit. Other exits were blocked by additional seats that had been illegally installed to increase the theater's capacity beyond its licensed limit of 540 to over 700 people. The Ansal brothers had prioritized squeezing more ticket revenue from each show over the fundamental safety of their patrons. The emergency lighting system that should have automatically illuminated exit routes when the main power failed was completely non-functional. This wasn't a case of batteries that had run down or bulbs that had burned out. The system had been neglected for so long that it was essentially abandoned. When investigators examined the emergency lights, they found them corroded, disconnected, and in some cases missing entirely. The cinema had been operating for years without a functioning emergency lighting system, and nobody from any regulatory authority had noticed or cared enough to enforce compliance. Fire extinguishers, which could have been used by staff or patrons to fight the initial fire, or at least create escape routes through smoke, were either missing, empty, or decades past their maintenance dates. The few extinguishers that were found were so old that their pressure gauges showed them to be completely discharged. Some were rusted shut and couldn't have been operated even in an emergency. The cinema had no fire hose reels, no sprinkler system, no any meaningful firefighting equipment that could have made a difference in those critical first minutes. Perhaps most damning was the fire alarm system. A functioning fire alarm could have alerted everyone in the building the moment smoke was detected, giving them precious extra minutes to evacuate before conditions became unsurvivable. But the Uphaar Cinema's fire alarm system had been deliberately disabled. Investigators found that alarm sensors had been disconnected, control panels were non-functional, and the entire system had been allowed to decay into uselessness. Without an alarm system, there was no automatic alert when the fire started. Theatre staff had to physically notice the problem and manually try to evacuate people, but by then, it was already too late for many. The building's ventilation system, which should have been designed to evacuate smoke in case of fire, instead became a delivery system for toxic fumes. Air conditioning ducts that weren't properly sealed or equipped with fire dampers allowed smoke to spread rapidly from the basement to the main auditorium. When investigators examined the balcony area where most deaths occurred, they found that exhaust fans on the walls, fans that could have potentially vented some of the deadly smoke, had been deliberately blocked with cardboard. The reason? The fans were noisy and detracted from the movie-watching experience. So rather than fixing or replacing the noisy fans, the cinema management simply blocked them completely, eliminating one of the few potential escape routes for toxic smoke. The stairways and corridors that should have provided clear evacuation routes were cluttered with storage materials, electrical equipment, and other obstructions. Some emergency exit doors opened inward rather than outward, making them nearly impossible to open when crowds of panicked people pressed against them from inside. Door handles and panic bars that should have allowed easy emergency egress were missing, broken, or deliberately locked. In their greed to maximize seating capacity, the Ansal brothers had installed additional seats in aisles and corridors, narrowing the already inadequate evacuation paths and creating choke points where fleeing crowds would inevitably jam together. The cinema had been operating with a capacity far exceeding its license limit. The legal capacity was 540 people, but on the day of the disaster, over 700 people were crammed into the theatre. This overcapacity situation wasn't unusual, it was standard practice. The cinema regularly sold more tickets than safety regulations allowed, packing extra people into a building that already had inadequate exit capacity for its legal occupancy. The Ansal brothers knew exactly what they were doing. Every extra ticket sold was pure profit, and they calculated, correctly, for years, that regulatory authorities wouldn't notice or wouldn't care. The theatre staff had received zero fire safety training. There had been no fire drills, no evacuation procedures, no training on how to use firefighting equipment, or how to guide crowds to safety in an emergency. When the crisis erupted, staff members were as panicked and confused as the paying customers. Some staff members actually fled the building through back passages that regular patrons didn't know existed, saving themselves while leaving hundreds of customers to fend for themselves in the smoke-filled darkness. The contrast was stark and brutal. Staff who knew the building's layout escaped through hidden routes, while customers died trying to find exits that were locked or blocked. The Delhi Fire Service, which should have been regularly inspecting the cinema and certifying its fire safety measures, had been issuing no objection certificates, despite obvious and documented violations. How did a cinema with non-functional fire alarms, no emergency lighting, locked emergency exits, and expired fire extinguishers receive fire safety clearance? The answer lay in a combination of bureaucratic negligence, understaffing, and outright corruption. Inspectors either didn't actually inspect or looked the other way in exchange for bribes. The system that was supposed to protect the public had been completely compromised. The Delhi Vidyut Board, the electricity department, responsible for the transformer that started the fire, bore significant responsibility as well. The transformer had a documented history of problems. It had caught fire on the morning of June 13th, just hours before the deadly afternoon fire. Rather than taking the transformer out of service for proper inspection and repair by qualified engineers, DVB personnel had performed a hasty superficial repair and put it back into service. No investigation was done into why the transformer kept malfunctioning. No risk assessment was performed. The attitude was simply to patch it up and hope it held, an approach that proved fatal. The licensing authority that granted the cinema its operating license had failed to verify that basic safety requirements were met. The license should have been conditional on maintaining proper fire safety systems, adequate exit capacity, and compliance with building codes. But the licensing process had become a rubber stamp exercise. As long as the right paperwork was filed and the right palms were greased, licenses were granted regardless of actual safety conditions. The Uphaar Cinema had been operating for 17 years on temporary licenses that were repeatedly renewed, despite documented violations that should have resulted in immediate closure. This web of negligence and corruption wasn't unique to Uphaar. It was representative of how public safety regulations were routinely ignored across India. The Uphaar tragedy exposed a system where rules existed on paper but weren't enforced in practice, where inspectors were overworked, underpaid, or corrupt, where building owners could violate safety codes with impunity as long as they had political connections or money for bribes, and where the public was left completely vulnerable. The human toll extended far beyond the 59 people who died that day. Over 100 survivors suffered injuries ranging from severe smoke inhalation damage to permanent lung scarring, burns, and psychological trauma that would last for decades. Many survivors developed post-traumatic stress disorder, unable to enter crowded spaces without panic attacks, unable to watch movies in theaters, haunted by nightmares of smoke and darkness and screaming. Some survivors suffered survivor's guilt, tormented by the question of why they lived when others died. Relationships fell apart under the strain. Careers were derailed. Lives were permanently altered. For the families of the deceased, the nightmare was only beginning. They faced not only overwhelming grief, but also a long, frustrating battle for justice and accountability. Many families had lost primary breadwinners, leaving widows and orphans in financial distress. The immediate government compensation announced in the aftermath was modest and slow to arrive. Families had to fight through bureaucracy just to get death certificates and access to bodies of their loved ones for funeral rites. A group of victims' families formed the Association of Victims of Uphaar Tragedy, led by Neelam and Shekhar Krishnamurthy, who had lost their 2 teenage children, 13-year-old Unnati and 17-year-old Ujwal, in the fire. The Krishnamurthys became the public face of the fight for justice, dedicating their lives to holding those responsible accountable and pushing for reforms that might prevent future tragedies. Their determination in the face of repeated setbacks and disappointments would become an inspiration and a testament to parental love and the quest for justice. The legal proceedings that followed the tragedy stretched out for decades, becoming a case study in how India's overburdened justice system can delay accountability almost indefinitely. A magisterial probe submitted its report on July 3, 1997, just weeks after the fire. The report clearly identified the responsible parties: cinema management, the Delhi Vidyut Board, the City Fire Service, the Delhi Police Licensing Branch, and the Municipal Corporation. The report stated bluntly that these entities contributed to the mishap through their acts of omission and commission. The probe found that cinema management had wasted precious time before alerting fire services, that proper distance hadn't been maintained between the transformer room and parking area, or that the movie wasn't stopped when fire broke out, that no announcement was made to evacuate the audience, that exit signs weren't battery operated, and that many exits were blocked. Based on these findings, courts issued non-bailable warrants against the Ansal brothers and several officials from DVB and the fire service. The Ansals evaded arrest for weeks before finally being apprehended in Mumbai on July 27, 1997. They were sent to judicial custody, but soon released on bail. The case was transferred to the Central Bureau of Investigation amid charges from victims' families that local authorities were attempting a cover-up to protect the wealthy and politically connected Ansal brothers. The CBI filed a charges sheet on November 15, 1997, against 16 accused individuals, including the Ansal brothers, charging them with causing death by negligence, endangering life, and violations of the Cinematography Act. What followed was a legal marathon that would test the patience and resolve of everyone seeking justice. The prosecution completed recording evidence with testimony from 115 witnesses by the year 2000, but the trial dragged on for years, with over 344 hearings during just the first 7 years. During the lengthy trial, 4 of the accused died of natural causes, escaping earthly justice entirely. 8 witnesses, mostly relatives and business associates of the Ansals, turned hostile, refusing to testify against them or contradicting their earlier statements. This witness intimidation and manipulation was a clear indication of the power and influence the Ansal family wielded. The Delhi High Court, responding to pleas from the Victims' Association, asked the trial court to expedite the case, but the pace remained glacial. In 2003, a presiding judge openly commented that the repeated requests for adjournment appeared intended to deliberately delay the proceedings, a common tactic in Indian courts, where wealthy defendants use their resources to drag cases out for decades in hopes that witnesses die, evidence disappears, and public attention fades. In a parallel development, victims' families filed a civil compensation case against Ansal theatres and the Delhi government, alleging negligence. The verdict in this civil case came on April 24, 2003, 6 years after the tragedy. The Delhi High Court found the Uphaar Cinema owners, the Municipal Corporation of Delhi, the Delhi Vidyut Board, and the licensing authority guilty of negligence. The court awarded 25 crore rupees in civil compensation to victims' families, a significant sum, but one that many families felt was inadequate, given the magnitude of their loss and suffering. The compensation included 15 lakh rupees for families of victims under 20 years old and 18 lakh rupees for those over 20. The court also directed 2.5 crore rupees toward development of a trauma center near Safdarjung Hospital, located close to the cinema. The court apportioned the compensation burden, ordering the cinema owners to pay 55%, since they were the maximum beneficiaries of the profits earned from the cinema. The remaining 45% was to be borne equally by the MCD, DVB, and licensing authorities, each contributing 15%. However, this civil judgment would be challenged, and in 2011, the Supreme Court reduced the compensation amounts. For families of deceased victims over 20 years old, compensation was cut from 18 lakh to 10 lakh rupees. For those under 20, it was reduced from 15 lakh to 7.5 lakh rupees. These reductions added insult to injury for families who felt the original amounts were already insufficient. Meanwhile, a disturbing subplot emerged in 2003 when the public prosecutor reported that several important documents filed with the charges sheet had gone missing from the court record or had been tampered with and mutilated. This evidence tampering suggested a deliberate effort to sabotage the prosecution's case. The court ordered an inquiry and dismissed a court clerk suspected of involvement. In 2006, the Economic Offences Wing of the Delhi Police registered a case based on Delhi High Court direction following a petition by the Victims' Association. The investigation revealed a conspiracy to remove, tamper with, and mutilate crucial evidence. In February 2008, the Delhi court summoned the Ansal brothers and 4 others in the evidence tampering case, charging them under sections covering criminal conspiracy, causing disappearance of evidence, and criminal breach of trust. This separate criminal case would run in parallel to the main trial, further complicating an already Byzantine legal situation. The evidence tampering case itself would take years to resolve, eventually resulting in convictions and additional sentences for the Ansals, though these too would be mired in appeals and legal maneuvering. Almost 9 years after the tragedy, in August 2006, the trial court judge visited the Uphaar Cinema Hall site, accompanied by CBI officials. The site had been preserved as material evidence since the disaster. The judge's inspection confirmed many of the allegations on the second-floor balcony, where most victims had asphyxiated. The space provided for exhaust fans on the walls was found blocked with cardboard. The inadequacy of exits, the poor layout, the violations of building codes, all were documented firsthand by the judge. This site visit came as the trial was finally nearing its conclusion after nearly a decade. The final verdict in the main criminal case came on November 20th, 2007, more than 10 years after the tragedy. 12 people were found guilty, including the Ansal brothers. 3 days later, on November 23rd, the court announced sentences. The Ansal brothers received the maximum punishment of 2 years, rigorous imprisonment, for causing death by negligent act. They were also fined 1,000 rupees each for violating the Cinematography Act. The court directed the CBI to investigate the role of other officials who had been giving temporary licenses to Ufa Cinema for 17 years, despite documented violations. The other convicted individuals, 3 former Uphaar Cinema managers, the cinema's gatekeeper, and 3 DVB officials, received 7 years, rigorous imprisonment, under Section 304A of the Indian Penal Code, for causing death by negligence. The court also fined all 12 accused 5,000 rupees each, and sentenced them to 2 years rigorous imprisonment for endangering personal safety, though these sentences were to run concurrently with the main sentences. The convicted were housed at Tihar Jail, Delhi's infamous maximum security prison. For victims' families, the convictions were a bittersweet victory. After a decade-long struggle, there was finally legal acknowledgement of guilt and criminal responsibility. But the sentences, particularly the 2-year terms for the Ansal brothers, who bore primary responsibility, seemed grossly inadequate for 59 deaths. The punishment didn't match the crime. The families had fought for justice, but what they received felt more like a slap on the wrist for the perpetrators. The legal saga was far from over. In December 2008, the Delhi High Court, while upholding the trial court's conviction of the Ansal brothers, reduced their sentences from 2 years to 1 year. This reduction outraged victims' families, who saw it as yet another example of the justice system favoring the wealthy and powerful. The Ansals appealed to the Supreme Court. On January 30th, 2009, the Supreme Court granted bail to both brothers pending their appeal. They walked free after serving only a portion of their already reduced sentences. The case dragged on through India's multi-tiered court system. On March 5, 2014, the Supreme Court upheld the conviction of the Ansal brothers, stating bluntly that the Ansals were more concerned about making money than ensuring the safety of cinema goers. However, the court referred the question of appropriate punishment to a 3-judge bench due to a difference of opinion between the two judges who delivered the verdict. This meant more delays, more hearings, more years of waiting for families seeking closure. In a shocking development, in March 2014, Sushil Ansal left India without seeking permission from the Supreme Court, which had imposed travel restrictions as a condition of bail. The Supreme Court expressed displeasure when this was discovered, but ultimately allowed Ansal to remain abroad for medical treatment after he gave assurances to return. This incident highlighted how even convicted criminals from wealthy families could manipulate the system with relative impunity. The final Supreme Court verdict on sentencing came on August 19, 2015, 18 years after the tragedy. In a decision that devastated victims' families, the Supreme Court imposed a fine of 30 crore rupees on each Ansal brother, but held that their jail terms would be reduced to the time already served, considering their old age. Sushil Ansal, who was older, was essentially let off with no additional jail time beyond what he'd already served. Gopal Ansal was ordered to serve an additional 1 year in prison. The court also ruled that the lack of a trauma center at nearby AIAAMS hospital had contributed to the high death toll, a finding that spread blame more widely but did little to satisfy families seeking accountability for those most directly responsible. The 2015 Supreme Court decision was widely criticized by victims' families and legal experts as a gross miscarriage of justice. The message seemed clear: if you're wealthy and well-connected, you can violate safety regulations, cause dozens of deaths through negligence and greed, and ultimately face minimal consequences if you can afford good lawyers and drag the case out long enough. The Krishnamurthis and other families issued public statements expressing their anguish and disbelief. Neelam Krishnamurthy said the verdict made a mockery of justice and sent a message that rich people's lives matter more than their freedom, while ordinary people's lives don't matter at all. The evidence tampering case concluded separately. In November 2021, a Delhi court sentenced both Ansal brothers to 7 years in jail and fined them 2.25 crore rupees each for tampering with evidence. This conviction offered some additional accountability, but by July 2022, both brothers were again released on bail, citing old age and health concerns. The pattern was consistent: convictions followed by reduced sentences, followed by bail, followed by minimal actual prison time served. The Uphaar tragedy's aftermath extended beyond legal proceedings to broader impacts on fire safety regulations and public consciousness in India. The fire exposed appalling safety standards at public venues across the country's capital and beyond. This wasn't the first Uphaar fire. On July 6, 1989, a fire had broken out at the same cinema due to a fault in the substation. After an earlier transformer fire at Gopal Towers in Rajendra Place, New Delhi in 1983, licenses of 12 cinemas, including Uphaar, had been cancelled. An inspection following that incident had listed 10 serious violations at Uphaar, but all remained uncorrected until the deadly fire 14 years later. The tragedy catalyzed significant reforms in fire safety regulations for public buildings in India. Authorities tightened inspection protocols, increased penalties for violations, and mandated specific safety features for entertainment venues. New regulations required automatic sprinkler systems, emergency lighting, clearly marked and unobstructed exits, regular fire drills, staff training, and stricter enforcement of capacity limits. The implementation of these reforms varied across different states and cities, but the Uphaar tragedy became a reference point in every discussion about public safety in India. The site of the Uphaar Cinema building itself remained a contested issue for years. In 2017, 20 years after the tragedy, the building was finally demolished as part of the court-ordered compensation process. The demolition was deeply symbolic for victims' families, the physical destruction of the building that had killed their loved ones. Some families attended the demolition, witnessing the end of the structure that haunted their nightmares. The land's sale proceeds contributed to the compensation fund for victims. Today, a memorial stands near the site, honoring the 59 lives lost. The names of the deceased are inscribed on a memorial wall: children, teenagers, adults, elderly, each name representing a life cut short, a family forever changed, dreams never realized. The memorial serves as a reminder of the cost of negligence and the importance of holding those in positions of responsibility accountable. For the Krishnamurthis and other families, visiting the memorial is a ritual of remembrance and continued commitment to the cause of safety and justice. The Uphaar tragedy remains one of India's worst fire disasters and a case study in systemic failure. It demonstrated how multiple layers of protection, building codes, safety equipment, regulatory inspections, licensing requirements, can all fail simultaneously when corruption, negligence, and greed are allowed to flourish unchecked. It showed how the pursuit of profit at the expense of safety can have deadly consequences, and it revealed how justice delayed can become justice denied when wealthy defendants can use their resources to manipulate the legal system for decades. For the victims' families, the fight continues. Though the primary legal battles have concluded, they remain active in advocacy for stronger safety enforcement and faster justice. They speak at schools, public forums, and government hearings, telling their stories and pushing for reforms. Their message is simple but powerful. What happened at Uphaar must never happen again. Every theatre, every mall, every public building where people gather must have proper safety systems. Every exit must be unlocked and unobstructed. Every piece of safety equipment must be maintained and functional. Every inspection must be thorough and honest. And when violations occur, enforcement must be swift and meaningful, not delayed until tragedy strikes. The Ufa Cinema fire killed 59 people in approximately 90 minutes. It was entirely preventable. Every death resulted from choices to cut corners, ignore warnings, disable safety systems, lock exits, bribe inspectors, and prioritize profits over human lives. The tragedy's enduring legacy is both the ongoing pain of families who lost loved ones and the reminder that public safety requires constant vigilance, honest enforcement, and the courage to hold the powerful accountable, regardless of their wealth or connections.